And before we get into today's podcast, we have a quick favour to ask the audience.
That's right. We're running a little survey at the moment because we want to hear from you. If you are a regular listener to the podcast, if you have thoughts and feelings to share, we want to hear them. There's just a few questions and it will only take you a few minutes.
We will put the link to that in today's show notes. But now, back to the deep dive.
Good morning and welcome to the Daily Aus. It's Tuesday the 17th of March. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Billi FitzSimons.
Today we are unpacking a pretty simple question with a complicated answer. Could Australia run out of petrol? The short answer is not tomorrow, but the longer answer involves a 33-kilometre strip of water in the Middle East, a war that's now in its third week, and a fuel crisis that's already hitting regional Australians hard.
So, like you said, we're now in the third week of this war between the US, Israel, and Iran. I think before we get to the petrol prices, we should zoom out a little bit. What is the latest with what's happening in the Middle East?
Well, to zoom out a little bit, we need to take it back to the 28th of February. Now, that is when the US and Israel launched strikes on Iran in a joint military operation that killed the regime's supreme leader and hit military and naval infrastructure across Iran. Iran responded with retaliatory strikes targeting Israel and US military bases right across the Middle East. So this conflict has since spread across the region, across the Gulf countries. And the conflict, as you mentioned, it's now in its third week. There is no clear end in sight, and things have escalated into other countries, as I mentioned, like southern Lebanon. We've seen the UAE involved and other surrounding countries in that region.
And I know we have briefly explained this on the podcast before, but just to remind everyone, what does that have to do with petrol prices?
Well, as it turns out, everything really, and this all has to do with the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that is a shipping lane off Iran's southern border. It accounts for roughly 20 to 25% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas. So that's how much moves through that strait every day until this conflict broke out. Before this conflict, oil was sitting at around $67 a barrel. Then Iran closed the strait to oil tankers and the price has surged to around $105 a barrel. That's a 40% increase in just a few weeks. Now, average petrol prices as a result have already shot up nearly 50 cents a litre across Australia's largest capital cities. And if prices reach $150 a barrel, some analysts are warning here in Australia, we could be paying about $3.50 a litre at the pump. And Billi, listeners will have noticed the petrol prices at their local servos absolutely surging.
And one thing that I've seen a lot online is that, I mean, you and I are living in a metropolitan area, but I hear it is particularly bad in regional Australia where there is not as much supply.
Yeah, this has been a big focus of the government in the last few days. We heard from the Energy Minister, Bowden. He has publicly said that rural and regional areas are facing what he called real and unacceptable shortages. We heard from one company based in Queensland, Transwest Fuels. They service about 500 businesses and this week said, we have no access to any fuel from tomorrow, zero, none out of Brisbane, none out of Newcastle. Now that has immediate consequences, not just for us at the pump, but for farmers, for transport operators, service stations that rely on independent distributors. As a result of that, there are now also these massive concerns about food security. If food from farms in regional and remote parts of the country cannot be transported to supermarkets everywhere else in the country, what does that mean for the prices that we're paying at the supermarket checkout?
Yes, that has been what I hadn't immediately put together, that regional Australia, they of course need petrol and oil, not just to drive their car, but literally to keep things running on their farm and then in order to get it to the metropolitan areas.
Absolutely. And if you live in a really regional or remote part of the country, you might need half a tank of petrol just to get to the nearest township.
Yes.
So often people that live in those parts of the country are buying a lot more, spending a lot more on fuel, and it is literally a lifeline.
Actually, on that, I also saw people talking about having trouble getting to the hospital because they didn't know if they had enough petrol. So the consequences are huge.
Yeah, it's much more far-reaching than just, oh, I'm annoyed that I have to fork out more at the servo.
Hey, I'm Sam. I'm the co-founder of TDA. With one button, 82% of you who aren't subscribed to this YouTube channel can change that and help Australian media. Click subscribe. Now back to the video.
I said before that it was a supply issues with regional areas, but as I said it, I realized that I actually didn't fully know if that was accurate.
Yeah.
Is that true? Why is it that regional Australia is so much more impacted than the metropolitan areas?
Yeah, well, you were on the money, Billi. I think we need to understand that as a whole for Australia, less than 20% of our liquid fuel demand actually comes from domestic refineries, domestic production. So we are really heavily reliant on imports, in the best case scenario. But then cities are kind of served as a priority or served by major fuel companies with more supply security, while regional areas tend to rely more on independent suppliers. So they have a less secure supply chain when it comes to distributors. I thought that this quote summed it up well from Dr. Lurian de Mello from Macquarie University's Business School, who this week said, "We do not lack access to oil in Australia. We lack secure access to ships willing to be able to deliver refined fuel." So that speaks to the fact that 80% of what we need comes from overseas. And when there are limits on overseas supplies, we feel it here quickly and we feel it worst in regional areas.
And so that's the issue. In terms of a solution, what is the government doing about it?
So there are a few things happening that I wanted to take you through. At the federal level, the Energy Minister, Chris Bowden, has announced a temporary lowering of fuel quality standards for 60 days. Now that sounds technical, but let me explain what it actually means. Australia has this requirement where fuel has to meet a certain standard for sulfur content. So for example, E10 petrol, which is the cheapest unleaded petrol, that will have a higher sulfur content than unleaded 95, unleaded 98, more premium fuels. In December last year, we introduced new sulfur standards, which meant that the quality of our petrol actually had to be of better quality with lower sulfur. But when you relax these sulfur standards temporarily, it means that fuel that would otherwise be exported overseas, maybe for blending, can instead be redirected into the Australian market.
Can I ask a dumb question?
There are no silly questions.
What is sulfur? And is it bad for cars?
It's not as bad for cars as it might sound. I think this is the important question. In the short term, putting higher sulfur content petrol into your car is not really going to be of any concern because, as I mentioned, Australia only recently upgraded its fuel standards. We're effectively talking about just taking a temporary step back from those world-class standards. Right. The main concern here, though, is environmental. So higher sulfur fuel produces more pollutants when it's burned. But in terms of mechanical damage, it really would only occur after long-term exposure. So you would have to be filling up your car month in, month out with this less regulated or refined petrol type, I guess, rather than, a couple of tanks over 60 days, according to the experts, is not going to permanently damage your engine.
Right. And so by them allowing petrol to have more sulfur, how much fuel will that actually add to the market?
So the government expects that this will add around 100 million litres of petrol a month to the domestic supply. Bowden has also released up to 760 million litres of petrol and diesel from our emergency reserves. And fuel company Ampol has said that it's committed to prioritising regional areas experiencing shortages. So there are a few moving parts that are focused on easing this supply burden and also easing conditions in the regions.
So you said that those new rules for sulfur had been introduced for 60 days. It sounds like a bit of a short-term solution, and I guess the hard thing here is that no one knows how long this conflict will go for. So what happens if it goes for longer than those 60 days?
It's the million-dollar question, I guess, Billi. And before these additional measures to ease that burden on supply were announced, Australia had about 4 or 5 weeks of petrol supply. Now that's across unleaded, diesel, aviation fuel as well. But then the question becomes, okay, will the government restrict how much fuel we can buy? You mentioned hospitals earlier. There are questions about should there be prioritization of who gets the fuel supply? Do we need to make sure that first responders have a guaranteed supply? For now, Chris Bowden has ruled that out. He said rationing's not going to happen, or in his exact words, that is not what we're contemplating. That is not predicted. That being said, though, there are some regional servos that have already taken matters into their own hands. We saw a couple in remote WA last week who introduced their own purchasing limits, one in New South Wales that enforced a $20 limit per customer to stretch supply.
A $20 limit per customer?
Yeah, which is when I think it becomes even more important that this is happening in the regions, because $20 might not get you very far.
That's not going to get you far at all.
Exactly. And a couple of Victorian stations actually ran out over the weekend, again in the regions, but they received resupplies yesterday. So a temporary kind of headache there. But as you can see, business owners are kind of making their own minds up about what restrictions to impose.
And I guess one thing to mention with the restrictions is that we have seen that some people are not just filling up their car, they're also getting what do you call it? Like a little tank on the side?
Like a jerry can?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. A jerry can. And they're filling that up and taking it home with them after also filling up their car. So that's why some petrol stations are running out even faster.
Yes. And you speak to a really important problem there, Billi, which is panic buying and this impact on petrol inflation that's caused by panic buying. At the federal level, Bowden has been really clear that it's not necessary. He's trying to dissuade people from panic buying and said that this is the sort of fundamental issue driving regional shortages. Bowden said, quote, "The biggest risk to fuel availability in Australia right now is panic buying. But some independent distributors have pushed back. They're saying the problem is structural, that major oil companies have been withdrawing from regional supply chains for the last several years, and that's kind of created this perfect storm." The opposition leader, Angus Taylor, has also pressed the government, saying Labor's, quote, "mismanagement of fuel security and the economy is driving up inflation and hitting Australians' cost of living hard."
Okay, so that's kind of the federal level of things.
Yeah.
I heard that yesterday, I believe the New South Wales government held crisis talks over what to do with petrol. What happened there?
Yeah, there's this urgent roundtable that was held in New South Wales yesterday, as you mentioned, and that brought together experts from a diverse range of industries and fields across transport, logistics, fuel companies, agriculture, local councils, mining, unions, consumer groups. So the New South Wales government is really trying to get ahead of these potential shortages or these reports of shortages. It wants to increase compliance checks through New South Wales fair trading, so focusing there on retailers and whether or not they are doing the right thing and charging a fair amount. And New South Wales also wants to expand price monitoring through its fuel check program. So a big conversation in New South Wales centered around inflation and panic buying, I'd say more so than global supply chain issues.
Okay, so where does all of this leave us? Because like we said, we don't know how long this conflict will go on for in the Middle East.
And it all really depends on that. If you look to the White House and the Trump administration, they're saying that the war could end within a few weeks. However, I would caution anyone with the language that we hear there. Within a few weeks is the kind of phrase that we often hear out of the US when it comes to conflict. And a few weeks can sometimes mean a couple of days. It can sometimes mean a couple of years. So Trump is planning to announce a coalition to escort ships through the Strait of Hormuz. So he's calling on countries that rely on fuel coming out of the Gulf to pitch in and to help sort of escort these boats safely through that important shipping lane. Back home, the federal government says it's not rationing, it's actively resisting going there. It also says it won't send its naval ships to the strait. But some experts say if the strait stays closed for several more weeks, there may be no choice but to talk about rationing.
Wow. What's the message to drivers right now? Is it to drive less?
Well, I think for most Australians, it remains don't panic buy, because if we all agree not to panic buy, then prices will come down to a more realistic level. But, you know, that takes a village, to put it lightly. The message from Bowden is fill up when you normally would, don't stockpile, take what you usually need so that no one has to go without. Interestingly, the consumer watchdog, the ACCC, is also actively monitoring this. It said that they're ready to hold wholesalers and distributors to account for breaches, quote, and will not hesitate to ask for the highest penalties appropriate under the law. So hoping there that maybe retailers who might be doing the wrong thing will be spooked into doing the right thing. And just finally, Billi, I wanted to talk about some interesting data that dropped yesterday from the Australian Automobile Association. This shows that there were record high sales of electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles in the last quarter of 2025.
I saw this.
Yeah, so now around 1 in 5 new cars purchased in Australia is an EV or hybrid EV. I think that it will be really interesting to see if this current situation and crisis around fuel and cost will increase that market and will drive more consumers to consider electric vehicles, because of course they're not having this problem.
Yeah, I thought that data was so interesting, particularly because the data period was before this war. So even before this war, there were a record number of sales for electric vehicles in Australia and a record low number of sales for petrol cars. And so, like you said, now the fact that this has happened potentially will lead to an even higher record. You can only presume that it will.
Yeah, and we don't know yet, not to make correlations that don't exist, but if I was about to buy a new car and I was paying, $2.50 to $3 a litre for petrol, I would be looking at my options, put it that way.
Yes. Wow, it is almost a jump scare hearing the term panic buy again, because it is literally 6 years this week that COVID, all of the lockdowns started happening in Australia. And
I have goosebumps, Billi.
I know, and everyone was panic buying toilet paper.
Where did the last 6 years go?
I know, it's crazy that it's been 6 years. But yeah, that was when I feel like that was the first time I really heard of panic buying.
Yep.
And you just are starting to hear it more and more, not to scare anyone, but the fact that term is coming up again.
Yeah, it's that kind of hive mind where people start to worry and they see, well, if everybody else is doing it, why shouldn't I do it? But similarly, if everyone doesn't do it, then it gets so much better.
Yes. Thank you for taking us through that.
Thanks, Billi.
And thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Daily Aus. Like we said at the start, we are running a quick survey for this podcast where we want to hear from you. We want to hear what you like about the podcast, what you think we could improve on. The link to that is in today's show notes. Otherwise, we will be back later today with the afternoon headlines. But until then, we hope you have a good day.